On my first day, when I arrived early, the school was a collection of old, high, deserted walls, discolored by years of repainting. What couldn't be missed was the classroom they had set aside, which was at the end of the corridor, on the blackboard at the back. The main staircase. The door to reading room 302. Every classroom smelled of old, dusty and chalky from decades of old wooden desks on the floorboards. Some of the rooms were carved with the initials of former students. There was something unsettling about the silence, but I let it go. I was just nervous. I told myself that first days are always strange, especially in new schools, and this one had its own reputation, but a job was a job and I needed a job for several months. Then the envelope arrived and was lying neatly on my desk when it arrived. There was no name on it, just carefully read the words written on the front in black ink addressed to Mr. Lee, meaning someone new. I was coming. I took it, tore off the top and slipped out a single sheet of paper. Read Rule 302 for the first room: never let any child sit close to each other. They must always sit far away from the desk. When a child looks at you for more than a few seconds, look away and pretend. Look at number 3. If you hear a scratching sound from under the floor, ignore it. Number 4. Don't look at the clock between 2:11 and 2:13. Number 5. If a child brings you a gift, do not accept it politely, refuse it and tell him to take it back. Number 6. Do not acknowledge any child who knocks on the door after the bell. Number 7. If you find a child standing in the corner, the wall, do not disturb them. They will leave themselves to themselves. 8 rules: when the bell rings at 3:15, leave immediately. Do not fall behind on grades or organization. I read the list again feeling calm, but I got it right because the initiation joke for new teachers: every school had a new exam. Oh boy. I folded the paper and put it in my bag. Maybe I'll save it for later just for laughs. And then it was like the door on cue opened and an older woman walked in. Her glasses low on her nose, silvery gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't identify herself, just nodded in my direction, then pointed to the table, her eyes sharp, and I could tell she was here. It had been a long time. Mr. Lee asked me. I nodded yes. I understood before. I just wanted to put it down, you know. Okay, follow these rules, he said. It wasn't a joke, and with that he walked out the door and tapped it behind him. I wanted to laugh, maybe scream. It was a good attempt, but something stopped me in the way he looked at me, as if he knew something, which I didn't. I didn't hesitate long after he left. I dismissed her and was back in my room when the bell rang. I was sitting at my desk pretending to relax. The students were starting to look normal like everyone else. The kid was a little pale, and yes, some were quieter than I was used to, but I told them if it was normal for me, new teacher, new year, nothing unusual. I soon noticed that the children had a strange habit. None of them sat next to each other. They chose their seats automatically. Part of the desk was scattered everywhere. I didn't even need to remind them. I felt a pair of eyes on me and looked to see a girl sitting by the window. Her face was blank and unreadable. 2. I looked at the attendance sheet. My fingers gripped the pencil tightly, and he was still looking. I could feel it, but I forced myself to keep looking, going over the list again and again, until I finally felt him look away, and when I dared, he looked up again, his attention back to the window, and the hour and the lesson passed slowly, and I went over the multiplication tables, trying to gauge their attention span, which seemed remarkably good, but only because they were not tense. They stared into my eyes with a seriousness I did not possess. As expected, as I was reading silently, I heard a faint but distant creaking coming from under the floorboards. I stiffened, wanting to look down, but the third rule popped into my mind. I completely ignored it. I continued reading aloud, forcing my voice to stay steady as the crunching sound grew louder, as if something was trying to force its way under us. It was hard not to react, but I forced myself to lean on the book whenever I wanted. To make the scratching go away, the noise finally stopped as several children looked on, but none of them said anything. With that they went back to their books and I read them. I realized it was normal for them. they heard this noise before I told myself I was done for the day. I just had to follow the rules. During the next activity, I noticed two students, a girl and a boy, looking at each other, seemingly covered in disgust. The boy had unnaturally sharp features, his eyes were a strange cold gray. The girl sitting at the table had teeth that were so small it looked pointy from where I was sitting. The first rule is don't give it to your child. I sat very close to the other. I understood what he meant. I watched them and noticed how tense they were, their eyes fixed on each other, and even though they didn't move, there was something strange about their looks. I felt like I was in a room full of predators, as if they were looking at each other for weakness. Workbook students moved slowly. The boy pulled a book out of one of the bags with almost mechanical precision, the boy's cold gaze never leaving the girl's lips curling into a slight smile as if daring her to do something. I wondered how close they had been sitting last year before anyone had thought of this arrangement. I decided to walk around the room just to relieve the tension. As I passed their table, I noticed something disturbing. The girl had claws on the back of her chair and deep scratches cut into it. The boy's wooden chair was marked with the same mark. I looked down to see that they both had faint scars covering their arms, most of them hidden under the long sleeves of their uniforms. They both noticed my gaze and their eyes widened without warning. When I left, lunch came and went without much incident. I took a break by myself and ate my sandwich at my desk, trying to act normal despite the strange events of the morning. The clock marked the time I didn't want it to be. I happened to look at her at the wrong moment, but I had a strange curiosity to know what would happen between 2:11 and 2:13 p.m. As if the intercom on cue had come to life, it was the same older woman I had met that morning. Her voice was clear and distinct. She didn't greet me or ask me how my day was going, she just said remember the rules, and then the line disappeared for the rest of the day. With each minute advancing towards that dreaded hour, I covered the first 3 rules without too much trouble. I must admit that I have never felt so tense in my life. I tried not to look at the clock and the children looked uncomfortable in turn, as if they had done this dance countless times. At exactly 2:10 I looked at the clock, determined not to slip. I looked around the room, trying to concentrate on something else, but something felt wrong. The room seemed quieter. I couldn't explain it, but the usual commotion of pages made everything fade away. When I looked up, the children were sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on their desks as if they were waiting. I was counting the seconds in my head and my heart was racing, wondering what would happen if I dared to look at the clock, but the thought of breaking the rule made me sit in my chair, my eyes fixed on the wall, the silent public relations ending. The heads of the students and the thickness of each mark on the other hand I could hear but not see. It was the longest 2 minutes, then at exactly 2:13 the silence was broken and the children moved on again as if nothing had happened. I let out a slow but relieved breath. I did not follow the rules, it just so happens that I can handle the worst, I thought, but then, as the clock approached the last bell, one of the girls who had been watching me before got up from her desk, and didn't look at me, or as she walked to the front of the room, holding something in her hand, stopped in front of my desk and stared at the thing she was holding, a crudely made doll sewn from scraps of cloth with its face on buttons. Dark eyes drawn in ink staring at me from the cloth. I made for you, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I remembered rule number 5, thank you, I said in a steady voice, but I couldn't stand it. Why don't you keep her blinking without reading her expression? And I looked at the doll in her hand. For a moment she looked almost hurt, but then with a strange blank head she turned and went back to her desk and put the doll in her bag. I looked at the clock and noticed that we only had a few minutes left. I only had to go before the bell, but when I looked around the classroom, I saw a boy standing in the corner facing the wall. She wasn't there a moment ago. My stomach turned. There's a rule that resonates in my mind. Don't bother me. They'll leave them alone. She still had her arms completely at her sides and leaned back, ignoring the other students. Staring straight ahead as if she wasn't there, I forced myself back to the table and resisted the urge to look over my shoulder for seconds, each second longer than it lasted until I heard the bell ring. I didn't hesitate. I barely held my hand out. Look at the class. As I walked out the door, the older woman was standing at the exit looking at me. She didn't smile or say anything, but there was something in her eyes. Maybe pity, I can't say. I did well to whisper as I passed so quietly, that the afternoon air outside was sharp and cold, biting my skin as I drove. I didn't look inside the building, I didn't want to, and I even risked a peek into room 302 through one of its dirty windows. I told myself to get used to it. Maybe it was just a rough first day and things would get easier, but once I left I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind, or that something was following me that night. I was trying to put everything out of my mind to get on my nerves. Weird kids. A strict set of rules meant to scare a newbie boy. I hadn't slept and I didn't know, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling I still felt those weird eyes. Every time I closed my eyes I saw a boy standing in the corner, a girl with her doll waiting quietly in the classroom, as if there was something hidden in the silence. I slept badly with a dream where I was alone in room 302 counting desks in the dark. I felt as if I was waiting for something that never came. I looked down at the clock. The chairs locked at 212 but never moved. I woke up in a pitch-black room with my heart pounding, and I stared into the dark, half expecting to see one of the children standing in the room. The corner. The next morning again, the school had decided early on to keep the routine. If the kids played any games or if the school had its own weird culture, I just dealt with it. The schoolboys had sent me out of office 302. I felt different, though the air was almost thicker as I walked, as if something had changed in the night. I looked at the desks almost instinctively, and the desk where the gray-eyed boy had sat the day before was frozen, devoid of all custom. Scattered papers and books left by other students, and a faint dark spot on the corner of the desk as if someone had spilled ink or something. The bell rang and snapped me out of my thoughts, and the students began to move. One by one, the children took their seats with the same steady, icy precision. When the girl who had given me the doll finally entered and hesitated at the door, looking towards the empty table, and for the first time I saw a flash of emotion on his face, and then he seemed to pull himself together. He sat by the window and turned his face away from me. After I came I couldn't help myself. Wait, where did I stop? I knew I couldn't remember the boy's name. I dropped him off yesterday, but he slipped my mind. My throat still trying to figure out where the boy who sat there today was. The silence that followed was choking me. All eyes turned to me, blank and unreadable. No one spoke. The girl the window rejected me. Her shoulders were tense. I tried to shrug, but the room was tense. I went back to my lesson plan and tried to ignore the discomfort in my stomach. The day was passing more slowly with each passing hour after lunch. I felt like I had been there for days. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting to see the boy with the gray eyes sitting in his seat or standing in the corner watching me. The other teachers were eating in a separate lounge, but I wasn't sure I wanted to talk to him. Maybe they thought I was weird. After lunch, I found another note on my desk. This time it wasn't an envelope. A single piece of paper was torn at the edges, as if it had been hastily removed from a notebook he was reading. There were consequences if you didn't follow the rules. Maybe other teachers were messing with me, maybe some students, but the handwriting was strange and thin. Uneven, as if written by someone who hadn't held a pen in a long time. I unpacked it, put it in my bag, and forced myself to continue. When I looked up, every single one of them was looking at me. The heads of the entire class turned in all directions, their eyes also blank with expressions. Still, I cleared my throat and turned back to the chalk, but I could feel the haunting eyes staring at my back for the rest of the day. It passed in a blur as I moved, keeping my head down to avoid the clock. 211 to 213. The scratching from under the floor started again, louder this time. It sounded like something was approaching the floorboards below me. I kept my face blank and ignored that everything had gone sideways before the package. I was packing my things when the girl who had given me the doll approached again with a small thing wrapped in it and a cloth in his hand. He held it with both hands. "Take it," he said. I whispered. And I remember the slow breathing, and I remember the fifth rule. "I'm sorry, I really can't," he said. "Why don't you keep it up?" His expression darkened and his lips momentarily approached something like a snarl, but then the expression disappeared and he looked at the wrapped thing he was holding. I tried to warn him off. He whispered and turned and walked towards the door, joining the other students as they entered. Silence fell and I quickly packed my things, remembering the 8 rules, grabbed my things and checked the room one last time, to make sure I hadn't left. I reached the threshold, and felt a strange urge to look back just to take one last look, as if I knew something about that empty classroom. It felt wrong. I resisted going out into the hall, but the feeling followed me. As I entered the hall, I saw the doorman, an elderly man, with a haggard face, sweeping the floor in slow motion. Specifically, I looked up when I met her eyes and something close to sympathy. They didn't say much. I paused, not knowing how to respond to the rules. He rolled his eyes darkly, knowing that they don't tell anyone everything. They think it's easier this way, but easier isn't always safer. I asked him what that meant. He sighed and winked at his audience with the things I looked at. Just remember, Mr. Lee, these kids are just a part of it. There's more here that they don't even understand. Before I could ask anything else, she went back to rubbing her shoulders, hunched over like a weight. His words shocked me, so I went home with those words, the image of those empty eyes staring back at me in my head, wondering if the doorman was a new person like me, trying to follow the following rules. I lay there staring at the ceiling and thought I had given up on looking for another job, and told myself I wasn't cut out for this place. But I needed a job and felt like admitting defeat when I left, so I left. Backroom 302 was quiet when I arrived, but something was different. There was a new desk in the back that I had never seen before, a small empty chair waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. I remember the gray boy and the coldness that washed over me. I never saw him again after that first day. He seemed to disappear. The students came and filled the seats one by one, faces blank and eyes tired. The girl who had given me the doll, she turned away. His expression darkened as he sat down. I noticed something in his hand. A little package like the one he had given me was quiet for the first half of the morning, and the children were doing the exercises with the same mechanical precision as if they were puppets on a familiar stage. I kept my distance and looked at them awkwardly, trying to follow all the rules. Then I heard a knock on the door before lunch. I froze, remembering rule number 6. I was not supposed to acknowledge any child who knocked after the bell, but this was different. The knocking was slow, deliberately echoing through the room in a strange rhythm. The children were unresponsive, their heads down, their eyes fixed on their desks as if they couldn't hear the doorknob. Then I grabbed it. The rule was clear: don't admit it. The knocking continued louder now. The constant sound seemed to echo off the walls. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to concentrate on the lesson, pretending I didn't hear. The door swings on its hinges, but as suddenly as it started, the knocking stops. I pause for a moment to breathe and sigh in relief. Whatever it was, it's over now. But when I step back into the room, I realize I've made a mistake. The students are no longer sitting at their desks. They're standing in front of me, motionless, with the same blank eyes. My stomach drops and I take a step back, nearly tripping over myself. The silent girl at the window stands with the doll a little ahead of the others, her hands in front of her holding that little wrapped package. Mr. Lee, she whispered to me. I didn't answer. I couldn't help but follow the rules. She continued with a hint of sadness in her voice, as if I had let her down. I hadn't bothered her. I hadn't broken any rules. He bowed his head and eyes slightly. He frowned. Yesterday I look back after the bell rang. You didn't have to set my heart on fire. I looked back for a moment. Look at the empty classroom. I didn't even think that would be considered a violation of the rules, he said quietly, the other children repeating the words in their voices. Look, come on. I didn't mean to start, but the girl raised her finger. And sometimes Macoma is one mistake, she said. She walked over and handed me a wrapped package. I tried to help you. I wanted you to be safe. I took a shaky step back. I didn't want to accept what she was offering. My instinct screamed. I ran. But I felt the roots of the girl's eyes darken, and for the first time I saw something old behind her, something bigger than the child. It seemed she was. The other students began to move around me slowly and methodically in a semicircle, their hands at their sides, their expressions unreadable, their eyes drawn tightly. I turned back, but I felt the wall against me. Look back. It's okay too. I won't break the rules again." The girl's expression softened almost to pity because it wasn't that simple, and then without warning she opened the package in her hand and there was a small figure made of roughly carved wood with features twisted and barely resembling a human figure, but it wasn't the DLL file itself that scared me, it was the fact that it looked exactly like me. The figure's face was painted with a dark spot where a mouth should have been, and its eyes were hollow and empty, and I felt a wave of nausea. He looked at her and the room seemed to close in on the walls. The children's eyes narrowed even more and they held onto the doll, as if waiting for something to happen. Then the girl slowly lifted the doll towards me and bowed her head. The pain in my skull was blinding and sharp like ice stuck to my temples. I cowered, barely able to stand. The room was spinning and my vision was blurry. I felt like my thoughts were unraveling like threads inside me. I tried to scream in my mind, but no sound came out. My throat was closed, the voice was gone. I was trapped in my silence, the pain shooting through every nerve. The children's voices began to echo in my ears, distorted and slurred. Their words, merging into one relentless chant. "One mistake is all I need." I felt the weight of their stares pressing down on me. I wanted to run, but my body refused. It wouldn't happen. I froze, my headache worsening. It felt like something was pulling me and strangling me, and then suddenly, as it happened, the pain started and stopped. I fell to my knees, my vision blurring as I tried to regain control. When I looked up, the children were still looking at me with expressions on their faces, but their eyes looked different. They were sharper and more focused, as if they were studying me. "Look what I'm going to do next." The girl with the doll knelt in front of me, her face still inches from mine. "Now you have to stay here," she said quietly. I tried to shake my head in protest, but no words came to my throat. Body numb, I felt the doll pull as if it was pulling inside me, as if it was clinging to my soul. The bell rang at the end of the day, but none of the students moved. They stood looking at me as if they were waiting for something. Then they slowly began to exit the room one by one. The look on their faces, their steps eerily synchronized. The girl was the last to leave. She stopped at the door to look at me once. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Lee. We'll try to be nice." When the last of them laughs at me, I stood up and leaned on the table for support. I looked around the room. My heart was pounding. I took shaky breaths and tried to control myself, but I could still feel the doll's presence. I knew deep down that something had changed. That I had left something behind, or that something was grabbing me and pulling me into a world I couldn't escape for long. I stood there staring at the empty classroom desks arranged in neat rows, and the slight scratches on the floorboards, barely visible in the dim light. It seemed normal, but I knew it had been months, maybe years, I don't know, but every day was the same. I walk in, I follow the rules, I teach the lessons, and I ignore the weirdness of it all. I see a doll on my desk looking at me with these empty eyes, her head turned at a strange angle, and I always feel like these rules are second nature. I avoid the clock from 2:11 to 2:13. I ignore the scratches from below no matter how hellish they are. That stranger knocking on the children's door, I seem to get to know the kids more. Some are really scary, but most are not so bad. They love studying, they always pay attention, they even actually remembered my birthday and brought me a special cake. It was really good, it tasted like strawberries, and I wish I could keep the memories. To leave, or at least turn off the summer. I wake up every morning and know I have to go back to that room. And whatever I want, I know I will never be able to.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.